For the GTX 1050 release, I'm doing things a little differently, though ultimately the end result will be much the same. Rather than kick things off with a big benchmark video, I'm going to check out the MSI partner cards in what will be a more standard graphics card review. By this I mean just half a dozen new AAA titles will be tested. I'll also be looking at overclocking, temps, power consumption, and of course MSI's board design. This will give us a good idea of what the GTX 1050 series is all about. However, don't fret, we aren't just getting lazy on you guys. Later this week, we'll put together an in-depth head-to-head comparison with the 1050 2GB and RX 460 2GB graphics cards. Shortly following that, the same head-to-head style comparison will be made with the 1050 Ti and RX 460 4GB graphics cards. So, there's plenty of budget GPU benchmark battles incoming. For now, let's see what MSI has in store for us with their GTX 1050 2GB OC. Oh, and for those wondering, you can find the MSI GTX 1050 Ti 4GB OC video here, as Steve takes care of that one. There's no reference, or rather Founders Edition version of the 1050, so MSI's design should be truly unique. MSI offers their prestigious Gaming X version featuring the twin Frozen 6 cooler, but here we have what I feel are the more sensible options in these base model OC versions. Here, the massive twin Frozen cooler has been swapped out for a much more compact design, which will make installing these new budget graphics cards in even the smallest of mini ITX cases possible, providing they have dual slot cards. The card itself measures just 177mm long, though the PCB is just 150mm long. Disappointingly, MSI has added an extra 27mm to the length of this card for no reason. Overhanging the PCB is a plastic shroud, no fans or heatsink, so this is an aesthetic choice then. Had MSI not done this, their 1050 would have been the exact same length as the R9 Nano. The entire card weighs just 329 grams, and the cooler accounts for less than 60% of that weight. Including the fan, plastic shroud, and tiny aluminium heatsink, the cooler totals just 193 grams. The heatsink itself tips the scales at 118 grams and measures just 95mm long, 90 tall, and 18mm thick. Yep, it's a baby. Knowing all this, it'll be interesting to see how thermal performance checks out and how loud the card gets under full load. Under the cooler, we find the itty-bitty GP107 die sporting 640 CUDA cores. Along with that, we have 4 GDDR5 memory chips made by Hynix that operate at a base frequency of 1750 MHz. By default, the GTX 1050 doesn't require an external 6-pin PCIe connector, so for this model, MSI has decided not to add one. They've also stuck with the basic 3+1 power phase design, though this should be more than enough to keep this 75W TDP card happy. Around at the I/O end, we find a DisplayPort 1.4, HDMI 2.0 and dual-link DVI output. These outputs should have most users well covered, and all three can be used simultaneously if need be. Nvidia has set the default clock specifications for the GTX 1050 at 1354 MHz for the base clock and 1455 MHz for the boost clock. MSI has beefed up these frequencies a tad by pushing the base to 1404 MHz, resulting in a boost frequency of 1518 MHz. This is a 4% overclock, so we aren't expecting huge improvements here. For testing, our trusty little Core i3 test system has been used, and we feel this is a more sensible way to test sub $200 graphics cards. So I guess the only question that remains is, how does this entry-level $110 Pascal graphics card perform? I'm glad you asked. Benchmarking was often kicked off with Battlefield 4, so it's fitting we continue that tradition with the latest version, Battlefield 1. For testing, we're stuck with the DirectX 11 API for now. There's still a few strange bugs with DirectX 12 that heavily impact frame time and minimum frame rates. Using the ultra quality settings at 1080p, the MSI GTX 1050 was good for 49 FPS. This made it just 2 FPS faster than the 950 and 6 FPS slower than the 960. Interestingly, it was 14 FPS faster than the RX 460, a 40% performance advantage in Nvidia's favour here. As an AMD favourite, we thought Deus Ex Mankind Divided would be interesting to include. Using the medium quality settings at 1080p, the 1050 averages 33 FPS. Meanwhile, the RX 460 was good for 36 FPS, making Nvidia's new budget GPU around 8% slower. Doom using Vulkan is another AMD special, though we have some very interesting results here. Using the ultra quality preset, the 1050 crushes the RX 460 with ease. Even at 1080p, Doom really requires at least a 3GB frame buffer. However, Nvidia's Pascal memory compression technology seems to get them out of trouble here and allows the 1050 to pull well ahead of the 2GB RX 460. I'd say this is a pretty disappointing result for AMD here. Gears of War 4 is one of 2016's most impressive game releases on PC, so it was a title we had to include. Here the 1050 roughly matches the old 950, which isn't overly impressive. That said, this did make it 15% faster than the RX 460. Sadly, Mafia III is one of the worst AAA titles to be released this year, boiled down as just a horrible console port. Still, the game does have a large fan base and it was just recently released, so we decided to include it. If you do want to play Mafia 3 with these entry-level gaming GPUs, be prepared to load up the low-quality preset. Even with the lowest quality settings enabled at 1080p, the 1050 was good for just 41 FPS on average. That said, this did make it 24% faster than the RX 460. Next up, we have Mirror's Edge Catalyst, and here the 1050 averaged roughly 60 FPS using the medium quality settings. This meant it was 18% faster than the RX 460, which just touched on 50 FPS for the average frame rate. Overwatch might not be the most demanding game, but it is epically popular and a heap of fun to play, so naturally we included it. Both the RX 460 and GTX 1050 had no trouble delivering highly playable performance at 1080p using the ultra quality settings. That said, the 1050 was 34% faster. Quantum Break is a 2016 release that's had a rough road. Since hitting Steam, the game plays pretty well, though DirectX 12 support has been lost. The GTX 1050 managed to stay above 60 FPS in our test using the medium quality settings. With an average of 68 FPS, it was a whopping 45% faster than the RX 460. When it came time to overclock the GTX 1050, we maxed out the power limiter and got to it. The end result was a 100% stable base frequency of 1575 MHz with a boost clock of 1689 MHz. However, when gaming, the core clock speed fluctuated between 1840 and 1860 MHz. The memory is also boosted from 7 GB per second to 7.5 GB per second. This overclock increased performance in Gears of War 4 by 7%, taking the average frame rate from 54 FPS to 58 FPS. The same overclock was enough to boost performance in Deus Ex Mankind Divided by 9%, allowing the MSI 1050 to match XFX's RX 460 2GB card. Here we see our Core i3 test system consume just 115 watts when configured with the GTX 1050, pretty incredible stuff. This means the 1050 uses slightly less power than the 750 Ti while delivering considerably more performance. Even with that tiny heatsink strapped on the GP107 die, this MSI model never exceeded 66 degrees in our game tests. That result in itself is surprising enough. What's even more surprising is the fact that the card was virtually silent under load. Efficiency really is king, and the GeForce GTX 1050 has proven this once again. As promised, it delivers very playable 1080p performance in the latest titles using respectable quality settings. Having now seen how the 1050 handles itself, we aren't surprised that AMD made the pricing adjustments that it did over the weekend. That said, how does the 1050 stack up against the RX 460 at its revised price point? Let's take a look now and find out. As you can see, even at $100, the RX 460 2GB struggles against the GTX 1050, costing around 14% more on a cost per frame basis. It's interesting to note that although much slower than the RX 470, the 1050 matches the value of AMD's mid-range contender at its new $170 MSRP. Based on the games we tested, the RX 460 2GB card would need to retail for just $85 to roughly match the cost per frame of the new GTX 1050. There was one instance where the RX 460 was seen to be faster, that instance being Deus Ex Mankind Divided. Doom using Vulkan was another game where we expected AMD to come out on top. Interestingly, whereas the 2GB VRAM buffer kills off the RX 460, it doesn't hamper the GTX 1050's performance nearly as much. As we expected, the 1050 is also incredibly efficient. Even so, it was hard to believe that our Core i3 test system was belting out almost 100 FPS in Overwatch while consuming a little over 100 watts for the entire system. MSI's little 1052 GOC card also managed to run reasonably cool, which was surprising given the tiny heatsink. The card was also surprisingly quiet, even under full load. The fact that you can slot this thing into pretty much any system with a PCIe x16 slot is amazing as well. Overall, the GTX 1050 is an exciting entry-level GPU, and graphics cards like the MSI GTX 1050 2GOC are really going to ignite budget PC gaming. AMD's move to discount the RX 460 was smart, and I'm keen to see how the two compare when testing over 20 of the most recent games. For now, the future of PC gaming looks bright. What do you guys think? Is the GTX 1050 what you've been waiting for? Let me know in the comments, and I'm your host Matt, as always, or at least sometimes. Cheers guys for joining me for another episode of Hardware Unboxed. To those of you that already support the channel, thank you so much. It's truly appreciated. And to those of you that would like to support the channel directly, I do have Amazon links and a Patreon link in the video description below. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you guys next time.